If you think that great leaders need crowns, armies, or noble titles, get ready to change your perspective. The story of Deborah proves that true leadership comes from those who listen to God's voice and act with courage. While many warriors hesitated, one woman rose to prophesy, judge, and lead Israel against its oppressors. Now stop and think. How many times have you felt incapable when facing overwhelming challenges? How many times has the oppression of the world made you believe that there was no way out? Israel went through exactly that. For years, they were crushed by King Jabin and his powerful commander Sisera, a man who possessed 900 iron chariots and seemed invincible. Fear reigned, hope faded, and everything indicated that Israel was doomed to servitude. But God does not remain silent when his people cry out. When oppression reaches its peak, God's response comes with power. And this time, his response came in a surprising way, not through a king, not through a great general, but through a woman. Deborah, a prophetess and judge, was called to lead her people to freedom, proving that God's strategy does not follow human logic. This story isn't just about a physical battle, but about faith, obedience, and spiritual strategies that can still be applied today. What can we learn from Deborah? How can we face impossible challenges and emerge victorious? How do we trust in God when everything seems lost? If you want to discover how this woman defied the cultural norms of her time, led warriors, freed a nation, and became a symbol of faith and courage, stay with me. What happened next was simply unbelievable. Before we continue, if you like our videos and feel that they have blessed your life, like and comment, even if it's just an amen. This makes a huge difference in ensuring this content reaches more people and impacts lives. If you're not yet a subscriber, take the opportunity to subscribe, activate notifications, and share with those you love. Help spread this message of faith and hope. Every like, comment, and share strengthens this work, which we do with all the love to build your life. Together we can reach even more hearts. Continuing. Israel was living through dark times. The people who had once experienced the power of God in so many moments were now under the cruel yoke of King Jabin, a ruthless Canaanite ruler. His army, led by the feared commander Sisera, was not only large, but also highly advanced for its time. His 900 iron chariots seemed like an insurmountable force of oppression. The Israelites found themselves cornered, with no strength to resist, no strategy to fight back. Each new day, slavery became more unbearable. The weight of subjugation crushed the spirit of a people who had been called to victory. But in the silence of suffering, something began to stir. Years passed and the oppression only intensified. Fear gripped the hearts of the Israelites, and many asked themselves, "Has God abandoned us?" It was a time of questioning, of inner struggles. After all, how could they rise against such a powerful army? How could they liberate a people when everything seemed lost? It was as if the chains of slavery were not just physical but spiritual as well. However, if history teaches us anything, it is that God never ignores the cry of his people. Each whip from their oppressors was a cruel reminder that Israel was no longer free. Women wept for their children, growing up under foreign rule. Men watched as their crops were taken, their goods plundered. Suffering shaped their days and nights, and any attempt at rebellion was quickly crushed by Sisera's iron chariots. Hope seemed like a distant light, an almost extinguished flicker. But Israel had faced impossible challenges before, and even without realizing it, they were about to witness one of the most extraordinary moments in their history. The greatest mistake any oppressor can make is to believe that the oppressed have no strength left to rise. The Canaanites underestimated the unseen resistance of a people who carried within them a divine promise. When all seemed lost, when the chains appeared unbreakable, the people's voices rose in prayer. Israel began to remember the God who had once parted the sea, toppled walls, and defeated mighty armies. Their cry was no longer one of despair. It was a call for a divine strategy, for a leader who would guide them back to victory. It's always the same. When God decides to act, He raises up an unexpected person at an improbable time. While Canaanite generals relied on military strength, God was preparing someone they would never expect. A prophetess, a judge, a leader. Someone who didn't need swords or iron chariots, but possessed something infinitely more powerful. The direction of God. Her name was Deborah, and she didn't just hear the people's cry, she was the answer to it. If Deborah teaches us anything, it's that God does not choose leaders based on human standards of strength. In a society ruled by warriors and kings, He raised up a woman to guide Israel. While Sisera trusted in his army and weapons, Deborah relied on the only truly invincible force, the God of Israel. This story was only just beginning. The impossible was about to happen. But how could a woman lead a nation against such a fearsome army? How would Israel rise again from such severe oppression? The answer lay in the divine strategy that God had already prepared. Israel could no longer bear the weight of oppression. When suffering reaches its limit, the only path left is to look upward. The people, once scattered and hopeless, began to remember the God who had always delivered them in times of distress. Knees bent, voices rose, and their cry reached the heavens, a mixture of desperation and faith. God never ignores a sincere cry for help, and this time was no different. The oppression of Jabin and the terror of Sisera were no match for the Almighty. The time had come for an answer, and it would come in an unexpected way. Among the people who prayed and wept, there was one woman who stood out. Her name was Deborah, and she was no ordinary Israelite. Deborah was a prophetess, a judge, and a spiritual leader. While many men cowered in fear, she stood firm in her faith. While the voices around her spoke of despair, hers carried wisdom and strategy. She knew that God never abandons those who trust in Him. When all seemed lost, God called Deborah to be the answer to the people's cry. Being chosen to lead in times of crisis is no small thing. Leadership requires more than just willingness. It demands vision and courage. Deborah had both. Under a palm tree, she carried out her role as a judge, listening to complaints and giving counsel according to God's will. The people already recognized her as a voice of authority. But now, she would be more than that. She would be the instrument of Israel's liberation. God's calling on her life was no small task, but she did not hesitate. Israel needed a leader who could prophesy victory even before it happened. Deborah not only received this mission, but rose up boldly to fulfill it. Her example teaches that no matter how big the problem seems, God always raises up someone with the right vision to solve it. Have you ever considered how many times a solution is right in front of you, but you fail to see it because you're still trapped in fear? Deborah did not focus on the size of Sisera's army. She focused on the size of the God she served. But faith must turn into action. Crying out is essential, but acting on God's direction is what brings victory. Deborah didn't just believe, she mobilized Israel. Many times the answers we seek have already been given, but we fail to put them into practice. How many times have you asked God for direction and when He spoke you hesitated? Deborah was different. She received the word and immediately moved to carry out what God had determined. There was a man named Barak, a valiant warrior, but one who hesitated to act alone. He was strong, but he needed direction. And who had that direction? Deborah. The prophetess summoned Barak and delivered to him a command straight from the Lord. It was time to gather Israel's army and prepare for battle. But there was one key detail. Victory would not come through human strength, but through divine strategy. The stage was set, the pieces were moving. Israel would break free from oppression, but not in the way their enemies expected. How could an army face 900 iron chariots without the proper resources? How could Israel, weakened and outmatched, hope to stand against such a superior enemy? The answer lay in what would happen next, a strategy that was not human, but heavenly. When God gives an order, He has already prepared the strategy for victory. Israel didn't just need an army, they needed a divine plan. And that strategy came through Deborah. The prophetess summoned Barak, a renowned warrior, and gave him the mission. Gather 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun, and position them on Mount Tabor. The Lord had decreed that He would hand Sisera over to Israel. The battle would not be won by brute force, but by God's direction. But Barak hesitated. He did not doubt God's power, but he needed reassurance, a presence that would give him confidence. So he made a request of Deborah. "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." Judges 4:8. He was a courageous warrior, yet he still felt the need for spiritual leadership by his side. And Deborah, with the firmness of someone who knew that God had already declared victory, responded, "I will surely go with you," but warned that the final glory would not belong to Barak, for the Lord Himself would deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. Here lies a great lesson. Many times, the victory we seek is already within reach, but our insecurity prevents us from advancing. How many battles have we lost simply because we insisted on doubting God's voice? Barak had everything he needed to triumph, but his hesitation almost prevented him from experiencing God's supernatural intervention. The problem for many is not a lack of strength, but a lack of trust in the strategy that God has already put in place. And here's the key: faith without action does not produce victory. The army was gathered, and Israel's warriors prepared for battle. But there was one essential detail. They were facing an enemy with far greater resources. Sisera's iron chariots symbolized invincibility, and any rational analysis would conclude that Israel was marching toward destruction. But when God is in control, logic doesn't matter. Obedience does. Many desire victory, but few are willing to follow the divine strategy all the way. And that strategy often defies human understanding. Picture the scene. Israel's soldiers looked around and saw a much larger and better equipped army. What kept them standing firm? The word that had been spoken through Deborah. When God gives direction, it's not about the strength of the enemy. It's about the power of His promise. What He declares, He fulfills. If He said He would deliver Sisera into Israel's hands, then it would happen one way or another. What was left for Barak and his men? To trust and move forward. Divine strategy often challenges human logic. Perhaps if another leader had been in charge, they would have tried to build better weapons, form political alliances, or seek reinforcements before attacking. But this was not an ordinary war. This was a spiritual battle, and God had designed everything so that the victory would not be credited to men, but to Him alone. Those who trust in the Lord do not need to fear the enemy's iron chariots, because the greatest weapon is always the guidance that comes from heaven. The battle was about to begin. Israel's army descended from Mount Tabor, and Sisera's warriors advanced with confidence. What no one knew was that God had already determined the outcome, and something unexpected was about to happen. The years of oppression were coming to an end, but not in the way Sisera had imagined. The decisive moment had arrived. Israel's army, led by Barak and guided by the prophetess Deborah, marched toward Mount Tabor. On one side stood warriors driven by faith and the promise of deliverance. On the other, a trained army, equipped with 900 iron chariots, confident in their military superiority. To human eyes, Israel was marching toward defeat, but in reality, the enemy was about to be caught off guard. The Canaanites placed their trust in their weapons, but the Israelites relied on something far greater. the God who fights for his people. The divine plan began to unfold in an unexpected way. As Barak's warriors advanced, God himself stepped into the battle. The Kishon River, which seemed like an insignificant detail on the battlefield, suddenly became an agent of destruction. A mighty storm struck the region, and the torrential rain flooded the battlefield. The ground turned to mud, and Sisera's iron chariots became stuck. What was once a symbol of invincibility now became a useless burden. The mighty Canaanites were now vulnerable. Chaos overtook the enemy's army. The soldiers who had once marched confidently were now in a state of panic. The horses struggled, the chariots overturned, and the warriors tried to flee from the judgment that had fallen upon them. Seeing their chance, Barak and his men attacked. With strength that came from the Lord, Israel fought and began to slaughter the Canaanites one by one. What had seemed impossible was unfolding before their eyes. Israel's victory was not just a military triumph, it was divine intervention. Here lies a powerful lesson. God can use anything to ensure victory for those who trust in him. Sisera relied on the strength of his iron chariots, but he forgot that the Creator of heaven and earth controls even the rain. The enemy may seem strong, but when God decides to act, nothing can stop him. Stop. How often do we face enormous challenges and forget that we serve a God who controls everything? The battle at Mount Tabor teaches that it's not the size of the problem that matters, but the size of your faith. Seeing that all was lost, Sisera made the only choice left to him. He fled. The commander, once feared by all, was now running for his life, abandoning his army. The chariots that had given him an advantage had now become his greatest weakness. This is what happens to those who place their trust in human power and ignore God's sovereignty. Sisera's pride had been shattered by the might of the God of Israel, and his escape marked the beginning of the end for Canaanite oppression. Israel witnessed one of the greatest acts of deliverance in its history. What had seemed impossible became reality before their eyes. The weight of oppression was lifting, and Deborah's prophecy was being fulfilled exactly as God had declared. When God prophesies victory, no enemy, strategy, or weapon can stand against it. But the story was not over yet. Sisera had fled, but his fate was already sealed. The battle was won, but there was still one final move left in this divine plan. While Israel celebrated its victory, Sisera was desperately searching for a place to hide. He believed he could still escape, but God had already prepared an unexpected ending. Sisera ran in desperation. The mighty commander who once boasted of his strength and his 900 iron chariots was now just a defeated man, fleeing on foot through the wilderness. His army had been destroyed, his strategy annihilated, his confidence shattered. He knew that if the Israelites captured him, his fate would be brutal. Every step he took was driven by fear, by the urgency of finding a hiding place. But where could he go? What he didn't realize was that he was already walking toward his final destiny. In the middle of the wilderness, he spotted what seemed like a safe place, the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Jael's family had maintained a peace treaty with the Canaanites, so Sisera believed he would find shelter there. He arrived at the entrance of the tent, breathless and exhausted, begging for refuge. Jael welcomed him calmly, but in her heart, something greater was happening. She saw this man at her doorstep and knew he wasn't just a fugitive. He was an enemy of God, an oppressor of Israel. Jael acted with cunning. She invited him inside and covered him with a blanket, giving him a false sense of security. Still, exhausted, Sisera asked for some water to quench his thirst, but Jael did something unexpected. Instead of water, she gave him warm milk, which quickly made him drowsy. He could barely keep his eyes open. Before falling asleep, still suspicious, he gave one last order. Stand at the doorway of the tent. If anyone comes and asks if someone is here, say no. But Jael had already made her decision, and it was not to follow the orders of God's enemy. Here is a powerful lesson. Victory often comes from the most unexpected places. Sisera fled the battlefield, thinking he could change his fate, but God had already written the end of his story. Jael, a woman whom no one saw as a warrior, became the instrument of divine justice. This teaches us that it doesn't matter who you are. If God raises you up for a purpose, he equips you to fulfill it. While Sisera slept soundly, Jael took a tent peg and a hammer. She approached him silently, firm in her decision. With a single precise blow, she drove the peg through Sisera's temple, piercing his head and killing him instantly. The man who had terrorized Israel for years was defeated, not by an army, but by a determined woman. And so Deborah's prophecy was fulfilled. The Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. The scene was shocking. Who could have imagined that Israel's battle would end this way? But God doesn't work as men expect. He raises up unlikely leaders, uses unexpected strategies, and overthrows the powerful through instruments the world despises. This was the case with David against Goliath. This was the case with Gideon and his 300 men. This was the case with Jael against Sisera. Victory always belongs to those who trust and obey God. Now, only one thing remained: announcing the news of Sisera's downfall. The oppression of the Canaanites had come to an end, but Israel still needed to recognize the true source of their victory. And this celebration would come in a powerful way. The victory over Sisera and the Canaanites was not just a military event, it was a manifestation of God's power. Israel was free from oppression, and this deliverance needed to be remembered, celebrated and recorded for future generations. So Deborah and Barak sang a song, a hymn of praise and gratitude, exalting the Lord for his miraculous intervention. But this was not just any song. It was a war anthem, a poetic declaration that narrated in detail the great reversal that God had brought about. The song begins by praising those who rose up to fight for the Lord. When the leaders in Israel take the lead, when the people willingly offer themselves, praise the Lord. Judges 5:2. Here lies a profound lesson. Victories are won when leaders take responsibility and the people align with God's will. Deborah not only guided, but also inspired Israel to take action. Faith is not passive. It requires action, courage, and obedience. The song goes on to describe God's greatness in battle. The Lord was not merely a spectator. He actively participated in the war. The lyrics mention that the earth trembled and the heavens poured rain, a direct reference to the storm that bogged down Sisera's iron chariots. Israel did not win the war with swords, but because God himself used the forces of nature as his weapons. This teaches us something powerful. When God fights for you, even nature aligns to guarantee your victory. Deborah and Barak also honored the warriors who volunteered to fight. In spiritual warfare, there are those who rise up and those who remain passive. Some tribes of Israel answered the call, but others hesitated and stayed behind. This was recorded in the song as a warning to those who choose neutrality in times of crisis. Indifference can be just as dangerous as opposition. Those who serve God must decide whose side they are on. Another striking moment in the song is the mention of Jael, the woman whom God used to eliminate Sisera. In a bold and impactful verse, Deborah sings, "Most blessed of women be Jael," Judges 5:24. Jael was not a trained warrior, yet she had the courage to act when God placed the opportunity before her. This proves that God doesn't choose the most prepared. He prepares those he chooses. Many times, the greatest battle is not on the battlefield, but within ourselves, in having the courage to obey at the right moment. The song concludes with a powerful declaration. "So may all your enemies perish, Lord, but may all who love you be like the sun when it rises in its strength." Judges 5:31. The message is clear. Those who rise against God will be destroyed, but those who follow him will shine with glory. This is the difference between trusting in human power and trusting in the God who can do all things. Israel not only won the war, but they sealed the memory of victory with a song. They understood that gratitude must be expressed, and that testifying about God's deeds strengthens the faith of future generations. But something even greater was happening. This victory was not just the end of a battle, but the beginning of a new era for Israel. After years of oppression, Israel could finally breathe freely. The defeat of Sisera and the death of King Jabin were not just military victories. They marked the beginning of a new era for God's people. No longer was there fear. No longer was there foreign rule. The Lord had delivered Israel once again, and this deliverance brought 40 years of peace and prosperity. But this peace had not come without struggle, without prayer, without obedience. The story of Deborah proves that the path to freedom requires faith and action. But the big question is, how long would this peace last? Israel's history shows a recurring cycle. The people cry out, God delivers them, Israel prospers, but then they forget God and fall into oppression again. True peace does not come just from the absence of enemies, but from remaining in God's presence. Sadly, many people seek God only in times of desperation and forget him when things are going well. How many times does this cycle repeat in our own lives? The silence of war had come, but the real battle is always fought in the heart of man. What Israel did next would determine whether this peace would last, or if once again the people would cry out for another deliverer. And now, what will you do with this knowledge? Deborah's story isn't just an ancient tale, it's a living lesson about courage, faith, and leadership. How many times have you doubted your calling? How many battles have you refused to fight because you thought you weren't strong enough? Deborah teaches us that it's not about what you have in your hands, but about who is by your side. When God is with you, even impossibilities turn into paths to victory. Now stop and reflect. What is your posture in the face of life's battles? Are you acting like Israel during the oppression, paralyzed by fear? Or are you willing to trust in God's strategy just as Deborah did? If God has already given you a word, why are you still hesitating? The time for standing still is over. Maybe your battle isn't against a physical army, but against internal struggles, fear, doubt, insecurity. Maybe your fight is financial, family-related, or spiritual. But the truth is, the same God who delivered Israel is still raising up unexpected people to bring victory. The question is, are you willing to be one of them? True faith requires action, strategy, and boldness. And now I ask you, what will you do with everything you've learned here? Will you let this story pass as just another Bible lesson, or will you use it as fuel to change your life? God's power is still available to those who trust in him. If this message resonated with you, don't leave without sharing your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, what did you learn from Deborah's story? How can you apply this lesson in your own journey? And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because there's much more powerful knowledge coming your way.